Hello! Imagine something extraordinary for a minute. Let's imagine something you're good at. It could be dance, it could be singing, it could be a sport, whatever it is that you want to be good at. Imagine that you're pretty brilliant at it. And suddenly, the most powerful person in the world asks you to perform whatever that skill is for them. But not just for them, also the 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 most influential people in the world in that field. Now, it's difficult for you to imagine that, but that's what happened to Shakespeare. He became a playwright, and then suddenly he's leading a company of the king's players, so he's sponsored directly by the king. And what this means is whenever the king wants to entertain, he asks Shakespeare to bring his company of actors to act. But not just that, he asks Shakespeare to write a new play for them every time and then replay lots of his old plays. This is an extraordinary thing that is difficult for us to imagine. But Shakespeare, born in Stratford, miles away from London, miles away from the seat of power, miles away from anyone who would be at court, is propelled into this exciting, powerful society and becomes a favourite of the king. So when this happens, when King James makes Shakespeare his star, Shakespeare is obviously incredibly loyal to him. But there are problems. Shakespeare was also fairly influential in the reign of James' predecessor, Queen Elizabeth I. But possibly an even greater playwright at the time than Shakespeare was Christopher Marlowe, and he was arrested on the 18th of May 1593 for being an atheist, for not believing in God, and then he was murdered on the 30th of May 1593, and many people thought that was a political assassination. So you can see that reality is a difficult thing to keep hold of. Christopher Marlowe seemed on top of the world in May 1593, but not long after, he gets murdered, possibly on the instructions of the Queen. And so acting on Shakespeare's consciousness here is the knowledge that everything he has could be suddenly ripped away at a moment's notice. Now, one of the big problems of the day is the Gunpowder Plot of 1605 that could have assassinated all the ruling families in England at the time, as well as the king. And many of these plotters, when they were found, turned out to live very close to Shakespeare. Shakespeare's children's godparents were connected as Catholics. Shakespeare's father may have been a Catholic. Now, there was a lot of suspicion around everybody at the time, but especially those with known links to Catholics. And many people were asking, as they still ask, was Shakespeare himself a Catholic, and did he need to avoid suspicion? Well, one reading of the play is that he is doing as much as he can to flatter King James and distance himself from any accusation that he might be part of some Catholic plot. Once the plot was uncovered, and King James obviously survived, he had this medal made, and look what it depicts. Innocent flowers with a serpent underneath it. So when Shakespeare gives these lines to Lady Macbeth, look like the innocent flower but be the serpent under it, he's deliberately referencing this medal that everybody in his audience would have understood, especially King James. And his political message is, look, I am not the serpent, I am the innocent flower. I don't just appear to be the innocent flower. But, as we've seen, is reality what it seems? Is it ambiguous? Was Shakespeare actually sympathetic to the Catholics, but desperate not to appear so that King James would still use him and his players, and Shakespeare could still become the most successful playwright of his day? Well, of course, it's not just Shakespeare's life that he's writing about. That might have been what was on his mind, but when he's writing the play, he's interested in what's happening to King James and also the other influential landowners and noblemen of his time. And they would also be absolutely worried that King James might find some reason to turn against them. Again, reality is ambiguous for them because they feel completely unsafe even if they're not. And this is why there are so many references in the play to appearance and reality. So when the witches say fair is foul and foul is fair, they're saying it's really difficult to work out whether something is good or evil, whether events are going to turn out as tragedy or comedy. So we can apply that to the witches' prophecies, who say that Macbeth is going to become king, but that leads to the foulness of him killing Duncan, and also the foulness of him not enjoying being a king at all. It could also be a reference to Lady Macbeth, who appears fair and beautiful as a woman, but is actually foul and bloodthirsty underneath it. And the same is true of London in the day that Shakespeare is writing. Yes, it opens up massive opportunity, but at the same time there are events like the Gunpowder Plot, or there are natural disasters like the plague, which killed thousands of people in 1605. And of course the plague broke out nearly every year, killing some people, so you were never free from it. And then there is the uncertainty of war, when the battle's lost and won. So yes, Macbeth is successful in defending Scotland against the Norwegians, so Scotland is free. But in the act of becoming the winner of that battle, he becomes so powerful in his own mind that he feels that he's also entitled to rule, and then Scotland suffers even more dreadfully perhaps than if Norway had conquered it. There's no art to find the man's construction in the face, says Duncan, ironically criticising the traitor, the Thane of Cawdor, but missing Macbeth's face, who is also a traitor, and instead offering Macbeth great reward. Perhaps this symbolises how at the back of Shakespeare's mind he's wondering how his rewards, as one of the king's favourites, might suddenly be taken away by James's suspicions about his involvement with any Catholic families or Catholic plot. When Lady Macbeth says to Macbeth, "False face must hide what the false heart doth know," he's echoing sentiments that James must feel, that there may be further conspirators, further terrorists, if you like, out to plot his downfall. If we go back to the time of Queen Elizabeth I, she had a great rival, the Earl of Essex, who was very popular in the country, and she had him executed. Well, the Earl of Essex's son in 1606 is 14 years old, and King James decides to have him married off to one of the families of his executors. In other words, he's trying to stop families plotting against him by making them loyal, to the extent that they had to accept people who were, if you like, their old enemies. And this is a metaphor for how he wants the country to accept him, even if many in the country see him as a foreign ruler from Scotland, an enemy, if you like. So we could even read this as a coded message where Shakespeare is saying, look, you might not agree with this king, but you've got to hide that and just put up with the fact that he's here. Or we might look at it as a kind of psychological message from his own unconscious mind, telling him to keep his own feelings to himself and keep flattering and ingratiating himself with the new king. Then we have this ironic statement from Duncan when he comes to Macbeth's castle and says, this castle hath a pleasant seat. It's deeply ironic because it's going to be very unpleasant for him. He's going to be murdered there. But Shakespeare's also pointing out a wider truth. In the play, this is dramatic irony because we can work out that Duncan is going to be killed there, and therefore we see his future and he doesn't. But in the act of presenting that, Shakespeare is telling all his audience, look, none of us can predict our own futures, and what seems so pleasant now could actually turn out to be our own tragedy, our own death. How does Shakespeare solve this in his own life? Well, one way of looking at his plays is as a solution to this problem. Yes, life is ambiguous, but what happens if we embrace that? So if all reality is possibly not what it seems, what if I make my living pretending that the unreal is real? So when Shakespeare becomes a playwright, he actually embraces this idea of we can't really know what the truth is by creating his own truth on stage. The truth is what you make it. And if you like, Shakespeare is a much better liar than anyone else at his time because he creates the best dramas. And the proof of that, of course, is that his players, his group of actors, become the king's players. He becomes, visibly to everybody else in London and therefore the country, the best playwright. However, we can also notice a tone of regret here. When Macbeth talks about his own life coming to an end and Lady Macbeth's life coming to an end, he says life's but a walking shadow. And this is an allusion to the actor on the stage. And he's saying, actually, our own lives are just shadows. We think they're real, we think they've got substance, but actually they don't. They're illusions. They can be taken from us at any time. They don't necessarily have any meaning. If there is a God, God is writing a script for us that we're not in control of, and it can all end terribly. We could see this as Shakespeare looking at his own achievements and thinking, actually, they're not so special. My success can be taken away from me at any time, just as my life could. And then finally, when Malcolm tells Macduff, I think, angels are bright still, though the brightest fell. Actually, I think that's Macduff talking to Malcolm in the scene that's usually cut from the play. He's making a really interesting observation about God and Satan. So as Shakespeare's audience would know, the brightest angel, the best angel, was in fact Satan. And Satan was God's favoured angel. God himself didn't see that Satan would fall, would become evil. And this perhaps is the final message of the play. If even God can't see ultimately whether someone is the innocent flower or the serpent, then what hope is there for mankind? Everything that we treasure could be taken away from us at any moment. And what's Shakespeare's solution to this age-old dilemma? Well, it's to throw yourself into the things that you value. And for him, it's the creation of a new reality. And this perhaps is an interesting similarity between Macbeth and Shakespeare. Macbeth does not leave things to chance. He goes out and gets what he actually wants. And Shakespeare is exactly the same. And this play also leaves nothing to chance. Shakespeare deliberately uses the same symbolism that King James used in order to ingratiate himself with King James and to show his loyalty. And so finally, when we look at the play, we can see it as a great masterpiece of art that Shakespeare uses to enthrall his audience, but we can also at the same time see it as a masterpiece of propaganda in which he spreads King James's message around the country, showing people that it's not just a wicked act to kill a king, but actually a pointless one, which will come back and bite you like the serpent does. Just like Macbeth is ultimately killed as a result of his own evil acts. Well, thank you very much for sticking with me. Look out for some more videos, and thank you very much for watching my channel.